the 2022 NHL Draft, where we would witness a magnitude of drama, as myself among many others were convinced that Shane Wright was the first overall pick. I mean, this man was not only an exceptional status player, but he even surpassed McDavid in goals and tied him in points in his first OHL season due to the pandemic wiping out an entire OHL season. Shane Wright would not see the development teams expected. Thus, the Montreal Canadiens would shockingly draft Yura Slafkovsky. And not only that, but Shane Wright would confusingly fall all the way to pick number 4. Which of course has led to many going back to a video where I said Shane Wright was going number 1 and comment that I was very wrong. So, thank you for that. And in my opinion, this will either be a massive success or blow up in the Canadiens' faces, as Shane Wright, in my opinion, is the safe pick who still has huge upside and a patented death stare. Yet, these draft selections are still nowhere near as questionable as the ones I'm about to go over. This first story is so bizarre. It has to be the most confusing draft story in NHL history. Because in today's game, teams like the Arizona Coyotes are on the brink of financial ruin. And although this is shameful in a billion-dollar league today, this was very common throughout the NHL timeline. And back in the 80s, the St. Louis Blues were struggling as they would continually make the playoffs with a losing record, because back in the day, it was far easier to make the postseason, and this mediocrity would lead to declining revenue, as they were reportedly losing $1.5 million per season when a franchise was worth $5 million in its entirety, which led to the St. Louis Blues owner desperately trying to find a new local buyer, if not to another city, which would have been good old Saskatoon. In fact, Saskatoon got so close to buying the team that it got as far as going to an NHL ownership vote. However, the results were 15-3 against the notion, with only St. Louis, Calgary, and Montreal siding with the relocation. And the Blues owners were so upset that the league went against the sale, they would attempt to sue the league for $60 million. And so at this point, they were enraged. They got so petty that they would straight up, and I'm not even joking, boycott the entire 1983 draft, as they would forfeit all of their draft picks and didn't even show up to the draft table. Now, they didn't own a first or a second in this draft. In hindsight is 2020, but there were several superstars, Hall of Famers, selected right after their draft picks, including Rick Tocchet, Kevin Stevens, Sergei Makarov, and last but not least, Dominik Hasek. And this was also during a time period when the NHL draft had 12 rounds, meaning they would forfeit 10 draft picks, which is the first and only time this has happened in league history. And so what was the outcome? The NHL would fire back and file a $78 million lawsuit against the St. Louis Blues ownership group, as they believed they did this to try to lower the value of their franchise in hopes that it would sell easier. But luckily by the end of the month, the Blues would finally sell the team locally, putting an end to this draft disaster. Ken Holland, a legendary GM who was instrumental to the Red Wings claiming 3 Stanley Cups. And I hate to say it, I think the guy is over the hill. And this is more of a PSA to the entire NHL in general, and it is getting better, but what is with the boys club culture in the NHL? Instead of injecting new talent, teams insist on recycling the same coaches and management. I just don't get it. And what stood out to me as a glaring, horrible decision that made me question Holland's sanity was the 2018 NHL draft. Because during the 17-18 season, the Wings were horrible, especially their blue line, as they had an aging core and desperately needed a left-handed puck-moving defenseman in the mix. And they were in luck, as they held the 6th overall pick, which was exactly where Quinn Hughes was projected to go. And not only that, Quinn Hughes was a Michigan kid. He was in their own backyard, as he was the best player on the University of Michigan as a freshman. And so the Wings were extremely intrigued, to the extent that they would even tell Hughes if he was there at number 6, Hughes was their guy. And again, it just made sense, as they needed an elite left-handed puck-moving D-man, and Hughes was exactly that. However, the 2018 NHL draft was chaos, as Kotkaniemi would be drafted 3rd overall, which would have been a massive draft day surprise if the Burgerman didn't publicly declare it way before the draft. Barrett Hayton, who was most likely involved in the illegal fitness testing scandal, not to his fault of course, but he would be drafted 5th by the Coyotes. And so now, the Wings were in a dilemma, as Czech sniper Filip Zadina would fall from a consensus top 3 pick right into the Red Wings' lap. So do they go with their guy in Quinn Hughes, or do they take the draft day faller? And well, we know the story. They would draft Filip Zadina, which in turn would make Jet Black Jim Benning show the first sign of a happy emotion since his first child was born, as the Canucks would pick him 7th overall. And we know the rest. Quinn Hughes has developed into a superstar, as he is among the top defensemen in the league, shattering points records while developing his defensive game, while Filip Zadina has had a really tough time thus far, showing questionable development as he put up 10 goals, 24 points this season, and Zadina still has the potential to be a 30-goal scorer, and hindsight is 2020, but the fact that they knew Quinn Hughes was their guy and went against their gut meant that there could have been a reality where Moritz Seider and Quinn Hughes were defense partners. That reality would have been disgusting, arguably one of the best pairings the game has ever seen. And right after the season, Ken Holland would move from Detroit, arriving in Edmonton, where he can now make questionable decisions there. Throughout the history of the NHL draft, most individuals point toward 2003 as being the most stacked draft ever. Full, and I mean full, of NHL Hall of Famers and superstars. Yet, the 2015 NHL draft has been slowly but surely proving to be on the same level, if not better. The Connor McDavid draft, as this draft looking back, seemed like every other pick has developed into a star. Kirill the Thrill Kaprizov was a 5th round pick, and for the teams who had a collection of draft picks, well, they just hit the lottery. That was exactly the case for the Boston Bruins, as they would make some big splashes heading into the draft, as they would trade Dougie Hamilton to the Flames for the 15th pick in 2 seconds, acquire pick number 13 from LA for Milan Lucic. Also, how did the Lucic trade somehow bring back similar value as the Dougie Hamilton trade? Am I missing something? This isn't entirely relatable, but just prior to the draft, Edmonton would acquire Peter Chiarelli from Boston and had to give Boston a 2nd round pick. Can we just sit on this for a second? Edmonton had to surrender a 2nd for the privilege of Peter Chiarelli destroying their own franchise. But I digress. And after shockingly finishing outside the playoffs the season prior, Boston owned pick 13, 14, and 15. And my God, they would go for it, as Boston would go off the board 3 picks in a row, selecting Zach Senyshyn, who was ranked in the 2nd, if not the 3rd, Jake DeBrusk, who was ranked as elite 1st, and Zaboral, who was ranked between 20 and 30. And all these selections have turned out horrible, with the exception of DeBrusk, but he too has had a rocky career. And what makes these selections mind-boggling? Matt Barzal was the very next pick. Kyle Connor, Thomas Chabot, all ranked in the draft range the Bruins picked in. And not only that, within the next 10 picks after Boston, these guys were selected. Like, excuse me? Because with the current roster that still has elite franchise players like McAvoy, Pasternak, Marchand the Rat, Patrice Bergeron, could you imagine a Boston team that had a Kyle Connor or Matt Barzal, Thomas Chabot, Sebastian Aho? They could have been a dynasty.